Humility is nothing but truth, and pride is nothing but lying. This is a quote by St. Vincent de Paul. What is humility? What does that remind you? Who do you think about, or who do you think of when you think about a friend of yours or a relative who is truly humble? If I ask myself that question, I think I have at first a little bit of a distorted view of what somebody humble might look like, at least at first thought, without really thinking about it, because that's what our general culture, I think, has been building. Somebody with a lot of humility, somebody very humble, is generally seen as somebody who's looking down, almost submissive, low energy, whispery voice. And I am saying this is what I would wrongly think about, and then I probably think about it twice and realize that's not true. But there is a certain cultural tendency to imagine that. And the real humble person generally is in fact the opposite of that. Is somebody who is confident, cheerful, and who can listen, properly listen, and obviously with a recognition of her own or his own insufficiency. The author Trevor Hammack said that humility is the nearly impossible task of being more concerned with your own sins and flaws than what you are with the sins of others. Here in Canto 10 of Purgatorio, Dante, which is a gorgeous, magnificent canto, Dante is going to tell us a lot about humility. He's going to describe it with words, with images, with art, and in a way that we can keep returning to and meditating forever, virtually. Canto 10 is a crucial canto because we are finally entering the actual Purgatorio. Something similar happened with Inferno as well, with Canto 10 entering the real meat of things, and something similar will happen with Paradiso as well. So Dante builds something like a triptych, a trilogy about pride and humility. And this trilogy is Canto 10, 11, and 12. We finally understand Dante's plan to describe the scenes in Purgatorio, which is to depict the purification process of the Purgatorio souls in three different parts or three steps. First of all, the physical punishment, as always, the metaphorical actual punishment. A meditation about the respective virtue, or the virtue that stands at the opposite pole of that particular scene, and a meditation about divine justice, a meditation about why God thinks it is right to impose the justice that he has imposed. One of the main reasons why Dante spends so much time and so much space in his Purgatorio on pride and humility, in particular on pride, is that he himself, he was self-aware. He knew that probably his main sin, the biggest flaw of his personality, was pride. And at this point, if we read all of Inferno and 9 cantos of Purgatorio, you as a reader know very well, you could subscribe to that. He does sound very full of himself. We would say for good reasons, because he was an absolute genius, but he sees that, and he is concerned about the consequences of that for his own personality, his soul, and his eternal life as well. So let's try to dive into this canto. Let's jump in. When I had crossed the threshold of the gate that, since the soul's aberrant love would make the crooked way seem straight, is seldom used, I heard the gate resound. The gate, closing behind Dante, is making a terrible noise, very loud noise. He refers to the fact that it's seldom used. The fact that it's seldom used means that not many souls make it here. We're going to see that even in terms of capacity, the terraces of Purgatory are much smaller than the enormous spaces that we've seen in Inferno. There is a reason for that. The expression aberrant love in the second line, or in Italian, il malamor, is crucial, really, really crucial, because It's referring to, in fact, the previous canto, Canto 9, where Dante was talking about all the different type of eros or love wrongly directed, that's been directed in wrong ways. We're always talking about desire, human desire and human love, but human love can lead us in even in perverted ways, or it can go in the right direction. Dante tells us that he has been listening well to the angel's recommendation, and so he didn't turn around nor regret his going forward. It's very poetic, this first simile of the path among the rocks that reminds me of a canyon, maybe something that I've probably seen in Arizona, the Antelope Canyon, when you go down and it's really narrow, because that's what he talks about. It's almost zigzagging into the rock, and this difficulty of proceeding has obviously a meaning. The meaning is an evangelic meaning, a gospel-related meaning, and not by coincidence. On line 16, Dante quotes the needle's eye. In Italian, the word is cruna, and it's a very uncommon word that is found basically or mainly only in the gospel, where I believe it's Matthew, yes, Matthew 19, where he talks is easier for a camel to go through the needle's eye than for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven. Just like throughout all the rest of Purgatorio, time keeps passing, and Dante here gives us the image of the declining moon that had reached its bed to sink back into rest. So it takes a long time for Virgil and Dante to go through this, let's call it canyon in the rocks. And at the end, Dante is exhausted. He's really tired because he, different from Virgil, he has to carry around his physical body. But both of them, the two of us, were uncertain of our way. This is a very metaphysical verse here. I'm talking about verse 20 and 21. The two of us, uncertain of our way, we halted on a plateau lonelier than desert paths. Doesn't it make you think about, when you think about a desert path? In fact, in Italian, he is specifically talking about strade per deserti, meaning an actual road that's barely visible inside a desert, within a desert. And what's lonelier than that type of image? It makes me think, being in California, makes me think of the Death Valley and how you have roads cutting through and complete nothingness all around you. It makes you feel really lonely. So what can help Virgil and Dante from this situation of feeling lost and lonely and confused, if not the divine presence? And God is there. We can see him in the next terce, in fact, in the number 3, which is always in Dante the symbol of God, where Dante says the measurement, the size of this first terrace would measure 3 times one man's body. 3, not a coincidence here as well. That's God's presence. Right here is the end of the first part of this canto. The canto can be easily split in 3 main parts. This part, which is the arrival and introduction of Dante and Virgil to the Terrace of Pride. The second part, where Dante is examining the 3, let's call them panels in high relief sculptures that are the meditation upon humility. And then the third part, where we're going to see the actual prideful souls, and Dante will begin to understand what it means to be a prideful soul in purgatory, and what is actually expecting himself as well. So it's incredible here how Dante hasn't even moved yet, and in Mandebound translation, I discovered that the bordering bank, less sheer than banks of other terraces, was of white marble and adorned with carvings so accurate, not only Polycletus, but even nature there would feel defeated. A couple of things here. The beauty of these engravings, of these carvings, in fact, is such that not only the artist who in Dante's time was considered to be the best sculpture in history, the best sculpture ever. This was probably Dante hadn't even seen any sculpture by Polycletus or even a drawing of it, but in many writings Polycletus was mentioned as the best sculptor of Athens. He was an Athenian who lived in the 5th century before Christ. What Dante was leading from an artistic standpoint, from a history of art standpoint in his life, was the gradual passage from the Romanesque style that was coming from the old Roman Empire to almost new Gothic that sort of was getting started. And together with this, there was a resurgence and a desire to go back to images that were a little bit more realistic and inspired by the classical forms and figures. Therefore, artists like the sculptor Arnolfo di Cambio, who is accredited for sculpting a big part of the Siena Cathedral, were artists whose work Dante actually had seen. And I'm going to show a couple of works of Arnolfo di Cambio because they are so realistic and precise and also busy with characters and people that we can almost better understand the next part of this canto by looking at these images. That's Arnolfo di Cambio. He was actually a student of the famous Nicola Pisano, who was one of the greatest sculptors in before Dante's time, so around the middle of the 13th century. The second thing that stands out immediately out of this verse is the reference to nature. We are used to think about nature as the ideal that an artist should imitate, but in this case, Dante says even nature would feel defeated. So it makes you take a step back when you read that, and then you realize that he's talking about nature being defeated, which is against every rule of art, only because God is the one who carved these high reliefs and these works of art. Now, from verse 34 to verse 97, we have the heart of Canto 10, and it's really the most important part of the canto, and it's extremely high. It's high poetically, it's high conceptually, it's high from an imagination standpoint. There are a lot of images that Dante completely invented originally by himself, and it's incredibly beautiful. It's a triptych, as I mentioned before. There are three main meditations or three images, and the first one is taken from the New Testament, the second one from the Old Testament, and the third one from the pagan world. The central figure remains Mary, the first and central figure of these sculptures. Dante is introducing the concept of humility, and no one above Mary can incarnate this concept better for Dante, and for me too. There's a lot to be said about Mary as the real heart of the Divine Comedy. Yes, at the end of Paradiso, at the very end of Paradiso, Canto 33 of Paradiso, Dante is getting almost close with God, and there is an apotheosis sort of scene. However, even many commentators said that it's the prayer that Saint Bernard directs to Mary that is probably the peak of Paradiso. And I would tend to agree with that because, as I probably have said before, I see the entire Divine Comedy as almost a progressive walking towards, or even running towards, this incredible prayer to Mary that is towards the end, even though it's not the actual end of the work. I actually learned something really interesting from Teodolinda Barolini, who is the Italian professor who has created the Digital Dante website under Columbia University. If you don't know it, go and check it out because it's very, very well done. She, commenting on these verses, she taught me indirectly that ekphrasis, ekphrasis, is the rhetorical trope whereby one form of representation reproduces another, and in this case, the sculpted engravings. So we have a game of art within the art with Dante. There are some sculpted images that are described by Dante's poetry. The angel who reached earth with the decree of that peace, which for many years had been invoked with tears, the peace that opened heaven after long interdict appeared before us, his gracious action carved. The first scene is an Annunciation scene. We have Archangel Gabriel, and that's where Dante starts to describe. That peace was the peace between man and God. Finally, with Jesus Christ, God reopened paradise to the human beings. That's what Dante is referring to here. After the long interdict, in this sense, since original sin. And here Dante starts bringing these carved works to life, to actual life. He says he did not see the angel to be a silent image. One would have sworn that he was saying Ave, for in that scene there was the effigy of one who turned the key that had unlocked the highest love. Beautiful periphrasis to refer to Mary. And in her stance, they were impressed these words, Ecce ancilla Dei, which also come from the Gospel. So here we have Mary, and she's not speaking, obviously. It's simply a sculpture. The angel is not speaking, the angel is not saying Ave, but Mary in her stance. In the Italian, Dante says in atto, ella aveva in atto espresso. So it means that she was so beautifully carved, the figure, that in her position, in her stance, it looked just like she was saying exactly those words, Ecce ancilla Dei. Dante is clearly enchanted by this work of art, and he probably is spending a lot of time admiring it, reflecting upon it, to the point that Virgil is reminding him to move on. He says, "Your mind must not attend to just one part," the gentle master said. And he had me on the side of him where people have their heart. Dante is going to describe in pedantic details here the position of him compared to Virgil and compared to the works of art. If you notice the reaction that Virgil has here, on one hand, Dante is telling us how Virgil psychologically is reacting to the scene of Annunciation, which is something that he actually wrote about in one of his writings, the one that actually saved Statius for Dante, but that he could not recognize. So there is a certain impatience from Virgil's side. And also the fact that Dante goes beyond Virgil. In fact, this is verse 52. Dante says, "Therefore I moved past Virgil and drew close to it." Dante moves past Virgil both morally and artistically. That's what's behind this line. In this second work of art, we have the Ark of the Covenant. So this is from the Old Testament, from the Book of Kings. And Dante says, "Carved in the same marble were the cart and oxen as they drew the sacred ark, which makes men now fear tasks not in their charge." I didn't understand this line the first time I read it. It's actually referring to a character in the Old Testament. His name is Uzzah in the second Book of Kings. He basically, while there is this procession to bring the Holy Ark back to Jerusalem, the Ark is starting to, it bumps into something and it starts to oscillate, and he sustained the Ark to make it straight, but he wasn't a priest, so he didn't have the right to do it. He wasn't authorized to touch the Ark, and he gets a lightning from God and gets killed pulverized by God for this action. The Old Testament God, we know, it was a little bit different from the New Testament God, right? So this is the meaning of men now fear tasks not in their charge. That that episode that happened in the Old Testament. People were shown in front, and on the group, there were 7 choirs, made 2 of my senses speak. One sense said no, the other said yes. It's a typical Dante convoluted ways to speak. The 2 of his senses here are his ears and eyes. They are giving him contradictory messages. His ears are not hearing anything, but he's actually hearing the choirs sing with his eyes, because the beauty of this work of art is unparalleled. It's something that nobody can even imagine, because God made it. Similarly, about the incense smoke shown here, my nose and my eyes contended to with yes and no. The Italian is quite funny. Al fumo degli incensi che verrà immaginato, gli occhi e il naso, al sì e al no discordi fensi. There was a discord between nose and eyes. And there the humble psalmist, who is David, King David, went before the sacred vessel. He was dancing, lifting up his robe. He was both less and more than king. Really accurate description of the humility of a great man who is actually so great that doesn't have a fear, is not concerned about looking even foolish or lower than what his status is. Dante is probably thinking about himself too here and saying something along the lines of myself as a poet, I am both less and more than a great poet, because I wasn't afraid in Inferno, if you remember, to use such lowly language that anybody, a farmer or whoever, could have used. And he sticks to the biblical narration here, where he says, facing the Shin, there was Michal, she was David's wife, who was not happy about David's behavior, and she was watching him from full of scorn and suffering from the window. Beyond it, there is a third carving, and there the noble action of a Roman prince was presented, where he's talking about Emperor Trajan here, who reigned between 98 and 117 AD. The Emperor Trajan is actually one of these controversial souls or characters who come from a pre-Christ world, and that Dante saves, but he's the only one out of this list of characters who was actually in history considered saved by the tradition itself. In fact, it was Saint Gregory who, through his prayers, had actually saved Trajan's soul. On verse 75, Gregory, to his great victory, this great victory that Dante is referring to is the salvation of Trajan, the salvation of Trajan's soul. And before looking at Trajan, we have already enough elements here to identify the red line that unites these 3 images. Certainly it's humility, the concept of humility, but in his Convivio, Dante had already written about these 3 moments when he was describing the concept of incarnation, the incarnation of God into Jesus. And really, Jesus Christ is the key that unites these 3 moments, also because he was the utmost example of humility. Dante tells us this is Emperor Trajan, and he relates a legend about this old widow who had lost her son in war. And while Trajan is ready with his army to leave and go into war, into battle or a campaign, she has the courage or the daring to stop him and to ask for a favor, and about having her son avenged. And Dante invents this quick dialogue between Trajan and the old widow, which is so sparkly, and it takes a while for us to understand that none of this exists. There is no sound in this carving. It's all happening in Dante's mind. What good can others' goodness do for you if you neglect your own? Basically, the old widow is calling out Trajan not only for his institutional duties to do his, but also for his moral duty. And the fact itself that Trajan somehow strangely decided to comply with the old widow requests, that was for St. Gregory what made the whole difference and what saved in the end Trajan's soul. At verse 95, we have this famous speech made visible, or visibile parlare, which was an absolutely new invention. Um, to invent not something like comics or little characters that are drawn or made and then some, because that's actually something that probably in Egyptian art in one way or the other had already been seen. No, Dante, what he's inventing here is much more similar to an animation, to an animated movie, something of like a Disney cartoon in our modern world, and that's why it was completely new. He's looking at a high relief and he's seeing it animated. He's even inventing the entire dialogue. This is extremely original. Then, to conclude this second part of the canto, Dante addresses us, the readers, and he says, I would not have you, reader, be deflected from your good resolve. Basically, do not be discouraged by what we're going to see now, because this is still the right way to go. And I thought for a second about why Dante would address us this way here, and reading some comments as well. This is really the point of the Divine Comedy being more a pedagogical work, having a pedagogical intent, rather than being a work of pure beauty or for the delight of our senses or for the pleasure of literature. In other words, poetry in the modern sense very often is intended as a work of beauty that delights our senses, and we take pleasure in reading it because it's so beautiful. In Dante's times, and probably in Dante more than in other authors, in other poets, it was a teaching. The poet was an educator, and having this concept of the poet as an educator, it doesn't really fit very well with our modern world. Dante sees somebody moving towards them, and they don't look like people, but is not sure what he's seeing. And Virgil explains that whatever makes them suffer bends them to the ground. Let's remember, Virgil has never been here before, so he's using his intelligence and intuition to try and explain things to Dante. So he's not answering like he was answering to Dante in Inferno with the truth. He's guessing, just like Dante is trying to guess and understand. This is why Virgil himself says, at first I was unsure myself of what they were. But let your eyes unravel what's beneath those stones. These are finally the prideful. We see them hunched under stones of different sizes. Dante is feeling particularly inspired, even more than usual, and he addresses prideful Christians. O Christians, arrogant, exhausted, wretched, whose intellects are sick and cannot see, who place your... He's actually talking to himself here as well. Who place your confidence in backward steps. Non v'accorgete voi che noi siamo vermi, nati a formar l'angelica farfalla. One of the most beautiful verses of the entire Purgatorio. Non vi accorgete che... It's very very much related to the Gospel. Non vi accorgete che siamo vermi, or we are worms, nati a formar l'angelica farfalla. We are born to build the angelic butterfly, which is a beautiful simile, and is something that was actually picked up by Saint Terrace of Avila, whose book The Interior Castle I'm reading in these days, and it's incredible. And she picked up on this beautiful similar metaphor in the same sense and with the same type of meaning. Pope Benedict, or Joseph Ratzinger, said, our world is full of comforts today. Today we have so many comforts, but we were not made for comfort. We were made for greatness. That's precisely the same point that Dante is making here with the transformation from worm to butterfly. Why does your mind presume to flight when you are still like the imperfect grub? It's difficult to translate what Dante says here. He uses a word which is antomata. Siete quasi antomata in difetto. This word antomata comes from Greek, And in Dante's usage, he sourced it from Aristotle. Automata would mean, in Aristotle, a creature that is not born from another creature, but is born from some rotten vegetation left in the sun. So it's a level of being or existence that is even lower than a bug or an insect. It's often translated as insect or bug, but Dante means something even lower here. Then, with the usual perfect balance, Dante goes back to the topic of art as imitation of life here, of mimesis of life, and he talks about these prideful souls as corbel for support of ceiling or roof. There are figures with knees drawn up into their chest. He's talking about, I don't know about the English word exactly, I think it's caryatides or caryatids, who were sustaining or supporting architectural elements, and they were shaped in the form of human beings or animals sometimes, instead of columns, instead of table legs, etc. That's what he's talking about. And such was the state of those I saw when I looked hard. They were indeed bent down, some less, some more. Just like in hell, there are different. We find out here that there are different degrees of sin. And even he whose aspect showed most patience, which probably means the one who probably had the smallest weight to carry, was in tears and appeared to say, I can no more. This is a reference actually that Dante is making to some sculptures and I probably am going to be able to show the image. In fact, several sculptures in his times that were human forms or animal forms supporting architectural elements, actually had the writing on the bottom saying non possum, meaning I cannot make it anymore, I cannot take it anymore. And so he's referring here to the architectural elements, and he's referring to the heaviness, to the weight of the prideful. And I'm personally putting myself in the prideful as well, in not being able to see yourself purely and objectively, but always having a little bit of a higher concept of yourself than what you actually are in different ways and different respects. You are basically burdening your shoulders of an extra weight. This is why the first quote that I started this video with is so great and true. Everything that about pride is a lie. Everything is about pride is false. And everything about humility is true. Thank you for watching. To the next one.